Good morning, everybody. My name is Lisa Pfadenhauer. Good job in pronouncing that. It was one of the first hints I got from my PhD supervisor that I should marry someone called Müller. Would make my life easier in the English-speaking world. Thank you for joining the session on rapid reviews. We're talking today about Cochrane guidance. But not only that, we're talking about how we actually operationalize this in 2 rapid reviews, which Jake and I conducted over the past 2 years or so. Jake, maybe you want to introduce yourself really quick too?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So as she said, my name is Jake Burns. Lisa and I have been working on the same team for many years now, maybe 8 or 9 years, and have done a range of different systematic reviews related to public health topics. And yeah, only in the last 2 years, in the context of COVID, have we really dove into the rapid review methodology. And like Lisa said, that's what we hope to share with you today is our experiences and yeah, what we've done with that over the last couple of years. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jake. So rapid reviews, as Jake said, we dove into the rapid review world more or less because we were working on COVID-19 related topics, and it kind of it was, I think, not our plan to dive into, but we somehow had to because of the situation and how it evolved and how urgently evidence was needed. That's why we initially started to work on rapid reviews. There are many labels around to describe rapid reviews. I just collected a few of them to give you a brief overview what a rapid review could be called. And actually, there was an interesting study being conducted at some point, and it was like looking at the rationale behind conducting rapid reviews. As I said, Jake and we embarked on rapid reviews mostly because of the situation and because we had to work on rapid reviews to be able to provide evidence in a timely manner. But a thematic analysis of definitions of rapid reviews identified 8 major themes that kind of were reoccurring. So first, and I think most importantly, rapid reviews are usually characterized by an accelerated or rapid process that is used in these reviews. And that was also our main motivation to use rapid reviews rather than a systematic review. There are various variations in method shortcuts you can take, depending on which methodological guidance you use. We're introducing you to the Cochrane collaboration guidance in a bit. The point of doing rapid reviews also and using shortcuts and doing this in an accelerated way also requires you to do certain limitations with regards to scope. So you have to narrow your focus. These definitions usually compare and contrast rapid reviews to systematic reviews, which we also will do in a bit. There's always kind of there's not always, but in many cases, there's a stakeholder rationale. So you are interested in involving stakeholders. And the reason why you're doing rapid reviews is resource efficiency, or it can be, as in our case, that we just need evidence in a more timely manner. But there are other rationales such as resource efficiency. It always requires systematic approach, and all of these definitions also kind of refer to bias and limitations. And of course, as any review, it tries to limit bias in the procedures that you're using in rapid reviews. This is the rapid review definition that Cochrane uses. It says rapid review is a form of knowledge synthesis that accelerates the process of conducting a traditional systematic review through streamlining or omitting specific methods to produce evidence for stakeholders in a resource-efficient manner. So it picks up on most of these themes that I just presented you, of these 8 themes, by having acceleration, streamlining or omitting specific methods, and resource-efficient manner. For Cochrane, rapid reviews should be driven primarily by requests for timely evidence for decision-making purposes. And I think COVID-19 was an excellent case of why us and many others embarked on rapid reviews, because we had to provide timely evidence for decision-making. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with Cochrane. That's why I also integrated a quick slide on describing to you what Cochrane is, because we will be talking about Cochrane quite a bit in this lecture. And also the examples we're talking about have been produced within the kind of framework of Cochrane, which is a charitable organization formed to organize medical research findings. It facilitates and guides the conduct of systematic reviews of healthcare interventions, but also diagnostic tests. We are mostly, Jake and I, working in the field of intervention, so we are also only reporting on systematic or rapid reviews today of healthcare interventions. Cochrane provides very thorough guidance on how to conduct systematic reviews. Some of you might be familiar with the famous Cochrane Handbook, which is, I think, an excellent source if you want to write a systematic review, because it kind of takes you through all the steps. And the latest handbook also really integrates interesting topics about considering equity and stuff in your systematic review. So I think it's always a good resource to use when you are doing a systematic review. And by providing these reviews, it facilitates more or less evidence-based or evidence-informed decision-making. So the big question, if we talk about rapid reviews, and that was one of the themes that the slide about the 8 themes describing rapid reviews described, it's really about how does a rapid review differ from a systematic review. And some of you who have embarked on a systematic review know that it can be quite a time-consuming activity. I think Jake and I have worked on a systematic reviews for 6 years at some point. Or was it 4? 4, I think it was 4 years. So it can be quite time-consuming. And we don't want rapid reviews to take the same amount of time. Rapid reviews, systematic reviews, just to give you a quick refresher, it attempts to identify, appraise, and synthesize all the empirical evidence that meets pre-specified eligibility criteria, and all of that to answer specific research questions. To the same extent as you might recall the slide on the definition of a rapid review, it also applies explicit systematic methods. And all of this happens with a view to minimize bias and to produce more reliable findings. And equally to a rapid review, a systematic review sets out to inform decision-making. These are the steps that have been described for a rapid review. And I could have shown the kind of the same steps for a systematic review, because more or less the steps that you take for a rapid review are quite the same, but within the steps, there's quite some difference when you do a rapid review. So you have, and you can take certain shortcuts within all of the steps that a rapid review entails. And the guidance I linked on the right bottom here, Garrity et al., that's the guidance that has been used by Cochrane rapid review producers to produce rapid reviews. And since we just don't want to make this about pure definitions and what rapid reviews and systematic reviews are all about, we would like to demonstrate to you how we used this guidance in 2 rapid reviews. And actually the first one, it still says forthcoming, but by now our rapid review on measures implemented in the school setting to contain the COVID-19 pandemic has just been published with Cochrane, which was a major achievement. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But we also published another rapid review on international travel-related control measures to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. And Jake's been leading on that while I've been involved in the measures implemented in the school setting to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. Just a quick side note, our rapid review has been published, but interesting enough, our rapid review has taken a bit longer than previously anticipated, and we might actually change the label of this rapid review because we didn't really adhere to the timeline that a rapid review requires, but I'm gonna tell you more about that when we're going through the steps we took to do this review. So the first step, as you've seen on this level, is setting the research question. And for rapid reviews, setting the research question, it really makes sense to involve key stakeholders. And that's also what the guidance also sets you out to do. And they describe that you should be involving key stakeholders to set and refine the review question, define the eligibility criteria, and also the outcomes of interest. They also suggest that you should consult with stakeholders throughout the entire process to ensure that the research question is fit for purpose, and also regarding any ad hoc changes that may occur while you're doing the systematic review. After you've set your research question and defined all your criteria, the PICO criteria. Yeah. Sorry. Did someone just say something? Sorry. Jump in if you want to say something. You usually set out to develop a protocol that includes review questions, your PICOs, and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And developing a protocol is something which all of the review family more or less has in common, because you're specifying a priori what you want to set out to do, and that's also what you do for rapid review. So when we did that for our 2 rapid reviews, we had certain challenges that we encountered. So as you all are aware, there was a high need for decision makers to address various research topics. And schools was one of the most pressing topics of these, as were international travel-related control measures. So you remember these times when all the countries locked down the borders and people couldn't travel anymore without difficulties, or not at all because it was not possible. But also what happened is that priorities, even though schools, for example, were a priority, there was a shift sometimes in the priorities over the course of the pandemic. So at some point, the long-term care facilities took in a larger level of attention than the schools did, and so forth. So there was always kind of a changing priority agenda in decision makers. And we were kind of trying to capture like these all of the priority topics, and we would kind of invite people to provide us with their top priorities that we could address in rapid review evidence synthesis. So we convened a stakeholder advisory panel for both of these reviews. For the travel-related control measures, we convened with the WHO, the headquarters, and the regional office, the European regional office, to kind of talk about the scope, what this review should be about, and the same for the measures implemented in the school setting. So we convened a public health stakeholder advisory panel, but only in Germany, where we kind of asked them to tell us about the highest priorities for where they needed evidence to make decisions, and schools were identified as the top priority for this quite interdisciplinary public health stakeholder advisory panel. The next step in the rapid review would be to define your eligibility criteria. So as in any review, you are supposed to clearly define your PICO, the population, intervention, comparator, and outcomes. But in contrast to systematic reviews, you would be able to limit the number of intervention and comparators you would be looking at. So you don't have to provide a comprehensive picture, but you can make certain cutoffs by limiting yourself to certain interventions and comparators. You can also limit the number of outcomes with a focus on these most important for decision making. So for example, if you look at long-term care facilities, you might have a different outcomes of interest than you would, for example, for schools, where education, for example, would be a key indicator, while for long-term care facilities, it might be others. You can consider date restrictions with a clinical or methodological justification. Just a quick side note, date restrictions with COVID are a bit easier to be set since the pandemic started at a quite certain point in time. You can also restrict yourself to certain settings you would be looking at. You could limit yourself to certain languages without adding any other languages. So you can just say we're looking for English studies only. You can even include systematic reviews as a relevant study design for inclusion. And that's in particular of relevance for public health questions, but also in health systems research or health policymaking research. You know that a lot of the evidence we have at hand in public health and related fields is not necessarily on an RCT level, but rather on levels that are lower on the hierarchy of evidence. So the rapid review guidance would allow you to cut off at higher quality study designs rather than including the whole bunch of studies that would be around. The problem with the question we had at hand was that the evidence on these two topics was quite rapidly evolving, and it was really hard for us to narrow us down to certain interventions, settings, outcomes, and study designs. So we were just not really sure where we could impose certain restrictions. And even though we consulted with our stakeholders on various points, they only could, provide us with the decision makers' point of view, and they could not really provide us with the evidence point of view. And we set out to not just, impose the restrictions that we received from our stakeholders, but both of the reviews embarked on a formal scoping. So we did not only just look for studies around, but we employed a very systematic approach to see what evidence is actually out there. So we conducted a rapid scoping review in the case of the school measures. So we just looked for all the studies out there that look at schools and conducted a scoping review and mapped the evidence. And we did the same for the travel-related control measures. And these formal scoping exercises, I think all of the people who have done a systematic review at some point did scoping, but usually not in that systematic way as we did it in our two cases. But for us, it was making things so much easier when we actually did the rapid reviews, because it really informed our limitations. So for example, we excluded all the studies that looked at travel measures beyond the national borders. So for example, if a certain region was affected by travel-related control bans, it would not have been included in the review, but we just looked at international travel-related control measures. For school measures, we came up with a really important exclusion criterion, which was that we were not looking at school closures at all. So we were really only looking at measures that helped people to keep schools open. So school closures was not a measure we were interested in. And we also found out that this was covered by a different systematic reviews. And also an important limitation we were able to draw from the evidence which was out there was that we did not look at childcare settings or university settings. We also realized by looking at the evidence that was out there that we had to apply quite broad inclusion criteria for the study designs by including all different kinds of study designs, allowing for inferences. And that comprised both observational and experimental studies, but also we included modeling studies, which was quite a new experience for us, working on usually on public health systematic reviews. We usually didn't include any modeling studies, and that was I think a big change for us when we started working on the rapid reviews on COVID-related questions. With regards to the search methods, as in any review, it's suggested to involve an information specialist. You can limit your main databases, searching main database to Central, Medline, and Embase. You can also search specialized databases if that is appropriate to a question at hand, but you don't have to. You should consider peer review of at least one of your search strategies, which I think is also kind of a standard by now in systematic reviewing. But in rapid reviews, you can also cut off certain limits, or you can implement certain limits by cutting off all the gray literature and supplemental searching. And if justified, you can search study registries and scan the reference list of other systematic reviews or included studies if that's appropriate. So in our case of the two reviews on schools and international travel-related control measures, we realized that a lot of the research that we were interested in was published on preprint servers. And at that point, and that changed over the pandemic, many preprints were not indexed in databases. And the reports some of the evidence that we were interested in was not published in scientific journals, but as reports. So what we did is that we ran additional searches in COVID-19 databases, the WHO database and the Cochrane database, as well as topic-specific databases such as ERIC for the school review. And these databases were also indexing preprints, which was important at that point of time. And then I think we did quite an extensive forward and backward searching of previously published systematic reviews, but also guidelines, international guidelines. And we also did some forward and backward searching for the studies we included in the rapid review. And with that, I'm handing over to Jake.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Can you see my screen now on the correct slide? Yeah, excellent. So I think Lisa's done a very nice job setting the stage for what a rapid review is, in what cases we might be motivated to conduct a rapid review, as well as giving us some nice insights into the first preparatory steps of actually doing a rapid review, some of the challenges and solutions that we faced. So I just want to continue on with the conduct. So when we're actually conducting these rapid reviews in the same format, what's the guidance from Cochrane? And what did we run into, what problems, issues, and how did we face those? So the first point that follows directly after the searching that Lisa just talked about would be the study selection, right? So in a traditional systematic review, as in a rapid review, we generally start with looking at the titles and the abstracts in a first round, determining which of those are potentially relevant. And for those that are potentially relevant, we keep them on for the next stage, which is the full text screening, where we go through them all one by one and assess the full text concretely against our eligibility criteria to determine finally whether each study should be included or not. So the guidance with regards to rapid reviews says that we should use a standardized title and abstract form. So when we're doing the screening, we should have some sort of standardized form that helps us to do that. It tells us we should conduct a pilot exercise, so where all the reviewers that are working on the screening look through the same 30 abstracts or 50 abstracts and calibrate this process. It says we should use 2 reviewers to duplicate screen at least 20% of the abstracts. And this is a question of capacity, really. This 20% is kind of a minimal recommendation. So if we can do more than that, great. And of course, for any conflicts we run into, it's good to clear those up early so that we can adapt the process so that we're all on the same page as early as possible. And it tells us that we should use, for those that we haven't duplicate screened, 1 reviewer should screen those. And a nice step to add on to this is then to have a second reviewer screen through all of the abstracts that were included by the first reviewer. So that just makes sure that anything that I, as a first reviewer, throw out by accident that's actually relevant would be picked up by Lisa, for example, as a second reviewer. And that saves some capacity because she wouldn't have to look at all those that I've included, because those are safely through to the next stage, but only those that I've excluded. So with regard to the full text screening, once again, recommends using a standardized form to do the full text screening. Once again, it suggests we use some sort of pilot exercise to calibrate our process. Here it says, for example, we might want to look at 5 to 10 full texts together as a whole team to calibrate ourselves and to make sure we're all moving forward in a harmonized manner. And then it tells us to use 1 reviewer to screen all included full text articles. And here again, better safe than sorry. If we have the capacity, it's good to have a second reviewer to screen all those full texts that were excluded by the first reviewer. So you'll see, and this will continue on to the next stage as well, but there's some common patterns here that they're suggesting, right? These standardized title and abstract form, a standardized full text form, also suggesting some kind of pilot exercise for each stage. And actually, those things are also really smart for any systematic review, not just rapid. But what we've noticed with the rapid review is that everything is just happening so fast. The timeline is potentially so short that it's just even more important to sit together and really intensively get on the same page at the very beginning. In a normal systematic review, you might have several months, half a year to make it through title abstract screening and full text screening, potentially even longer. And when your timeline is so long, there's room and there's time to clear up problems as you go along. And maybe this calibration, this intensive calibration, becomes less important because this can happen iteratively. But we really did realize through our reviews that this intensive calibration and piloting, as well as these standardized forms and standardized guidance, are really important to structure the process. So a challenge we had here was that there was a real need to integrate staff that was new to our team and had less rapid review experience. But we needed to integrate them into this process within a very, very short time period. So how did we do this? Like I just said, the extensive calibration was key. Because we had a lot of inexperienced reviewers working on this, and because our timeline was so short, actually, you know, it was a bit counterintuitive, because it would have been nice to only single screen titles and abstracts, or at least this 20% in duplicate. But actually, we determined to make sure we weren't throwing out lots of relevant studies, we needed to do double screening at all stages. So that's what we did. In order to make sure that both the experienced and non-experienced reviewers had a chance to clear up any questions as soon as possible, we had what we called a rolling question sheet. So this was basically an online document that was updated in real time, where all those people working on the review could post questions, and where the leaders of the review could answer, you know, within ideally more or less real time, but also within a couple hours to have those questions cleared up. So these rolling questions was quite a nice way to make sure things moved quickly, uncertainties were cleared up without delay. And we also had regular daily, at some point, meetings, but when things slowed down a bit, or for other steps, we also had weekly meetings just to make sure that we could come together and discuss things in a structured manner. So data extraction, I think, has many similarities to the study selection. Here, the guidance says it's probably best to use a single reviewer to extract data using a piloted form. And then they said you can use a second reviewer to check all data for correctness and completeness. They also suggest that you really limit the data that's extracted to a minimal set of required data items. So, you know, Lisa mentioned that we worked on a Cochrane review. I think it must have been about 5 years, probably, is how long our longest took. And sometimes it happens that when you get to the end of the data extraction process and start to move things into pieces and start to write up the review, you realize that actually a lot of the data that you extracted might not have been necessary, that it's really just kind of additional detail that you don't end up incorporating into the review. And so this is what you really want to avoid at the rapid review level. You really don't want to be doing any additional work that you're not gonna be using. So it's important at the front end of the review, when you're planning it, to really think about, okay, what exactly do I need? How can I operationalize this into an extraction process so that I'm getting exactly the information I need and no more? So that's where really working through and piloting this standardized form for data extraction is quite important. And the guidance also says you can consider using data from existing systematic reviews that can help you save time on your own data extraction. So this, for us, unfortunately, just wasn't an option, because you know, our reviews weren't really overlapping with any other systematic reviews. But it could be the case, if you're planning a rapid review, that it lines up that some other systematic reviews have extracted part of the data you need, and in such a case, you could consider using that data. So the challenge here, again, the first one we just saw for the last screen, it was really the last stage. It was really, how can we onboard members to the team who might not have very much experience extracting data in a short and efficient time, so that they're up to speed and we can be confident and they can be confident in the work that they're doing. And linked to that, it's really challenging, even in a normal systematic review, to ensure that data is being extracted in a consistent and harmonized way across extractors. So if you have 8 different people extracting studies, you're going to have 8 slightly different styles of how people extract, the level of detail people extract, how they understand particular fields that they're extracting. And obviously, if you have 8 styles that are quite different, it makes the next stages of really pulling all the information together, of summarizing and synthesizing that data, particularly challenging. So that was the challenge, is how to minimize the differences across reviewers, and how to make sure that the data extraction is happening in an efficient and harmonized way. And here again, looking at how we address this, intensive calibration was quite important. Also, we learned quite early on that it might be a better use of your resources not to spread the extraction across the whole team. Let's say we had, I think, up to 15 people working on these reviews. It might not be efficient and smart to have all 15 people extracting data, but really honing in on one specific team, a smaller team of people. We called this the core team, to do the data extraction. So that was something that really helped us to address this challenge of the consistency and the harmonization across people extracting. Also, these challenges that arose, or questions about how to best harmonize, this was regularly discussed within the core team. So this small group of around 3, 4, 5 people met regularly, or had short exchanges to clear up questions more or less in real time, to make sure that things were going along smoothly. And I think something that's actually quite important, and we realized multiple times that you do simply catch mistakes this way, is to make sure that the data is checked for accuracy one final time whenever it's incorporated into the text, into tables, into figures. So it's great to check the extraction. Oftentimes it was more or less 2, maybe even 3 people that had gone over an extraction form by the time we called it finalized. But it was still important that one last time, when taking it from the extraction form into the manuscript, to make sure that it is accurate and complete. So data extraction, I think, was really particularly challenging, especially for these COVID-19 questions, where the landscape, the study, the evidence base was shifting quite quickly, and the questions themselves were quite complicated. So I think this is one area where the challenges were substantial, and I think working through these solutions and coming up with good processes was sometimes not straightforward, but I think we found a good way in the end. So risk of bias assessment, in a rapid review, the rapid review guidance says use a validated risk of bias tool if available for the included study designs. So we might be included different study designs. It's important to think through, well, which validated tools exist for these specific study designs. It suggests to use a single reviewer to rate risk of bias, but then to have a second reviewer to fully verify the risk of bias judgment, as well as the supporting statements. And here again, I think this is quite important to make sure things are done correctly. And then it says, well, maybe if we're looking at many outcomes, we might not want to look at the risk of bias for all of those outcomes, but we might want to just focus on those outcomes that are most important for decision making, and only do the risk of bias assessment for those outcomes. So one more way we can kind of build in a shortcut to make sure that we're using our capacity wisely. So here again, the first challenge you'll recognize from the last several steps. It was just something that went throughout the whole process, that dealing with new staff who were quite keen to come on board and to be heavily involved, but also to make sure that they were well prepared to do so. And linked to that, and also similar to the last stage, with risk of bias assessment, we had the same issue with consistency. So how the different assessors were understanding the different risk of bias domains, and how they were applying them to these complex studies was something that was a challenge. And again, here the calibration was quite important. So really looking at multiple different types of studies and trying to converge on how, as a team, we wanted to assess these types of studies. We also had the risk of bias assessment done by senior staff who were part of the review team, who had lots of experience with risk of bias tools for various types of studies. So this was somewhere between 2 to 3 people who had to look at every single study. And then we had the more junior or less experienced members going through and doing the verifications and clearing up any questions or issues. And we also had kind of ongoing, but also a final discussion and harmonization of judgments among the assessor team. So really just to make sure, once again, that when we go back and look at it, take a step back and look at it from the zoomed out perspective, that we've treated all of the studies very similarly, both over time, but also within across our different assessors to make sure we're putting forth a consistent and harmonized product. Okay, we're coming towards the end. So now we have all the data that we've extracted, right? And now we want to take it and conduct the synthesis, the data synthesis. So the rapid review guidance tells us that we want to synthesize the evidence narratively, that we should only consider a meta-analysis if appropriate. So what does that mean? I mean, I think this discussion can be a complex one as well. But the main point is that the studies need to be similar enough to pool statistically. And I think the perspective of the rapid review guidance is often the topics that we're conducting rapid reviews for, where we need evidence quite quickly. Oftentimes these don't lend themselves well to meta-analysis. So like we saw for the question on schools that Lisa described, as well as the question on international travel, what we uncovered was just so different, so variant from one another, that it was clear quite early that this meta-analysis was not going to be appropriate. But if you do a meta-analysis, there's really no shortcut here. The meta-analysis you conduct for a rapid review is the same as what you would conduct for a systematic review. And lastly, linked to the grade assessment, so the assessment of certainty, it recommends using a single reviewer to conduct the assessment, and then as for risk of bias, to have all judgments as well as the rationales for the judgments verified by a second reviewer. So similar to and linked to data extraction, this was a really particularly challenging stage of the review. And the main challenge, like I mentioned earlier, related just to the highly heterogeneous nature of the data from the very different included studies. And specifically related to this, the incorporation of modeling studies that Lisa mentioned earlier that complicated several steps of the review. So how did we do this? Well, we put a lot of thought into how we wanted to structure our narrative synthesis. So this was, for example, I think this is quite the traditional way of structuring a data synthesis, no matter whether it's narrative, whether it's a meta-analysis, but we stratified it by intervention type as well as by outcome category. So this SWIM guidance, that's the synthesis without meta-analysis, which was published, I think, the first time in 2018, and was also part of the updated Cochrane handbook. So really looking at this SWIM guidance, how it tells us to best conduct these narrative synthesis was really important, but also thinking beyond this, because this guidance didn't really have any thoughts or guidance on how to deal with modeling studies, how to integrate them into an overall synthesis plan. So using the SWIM guidance, but also thinking beyond that was important. At the same time, we realized it was important to separate the synthesis of what we call real world studies, so studies that are actually using observed data and real world phenomena, separating those from modeling studies that were kind of simulating their own reality to one extent or the other. And basically the final product was something like a phased approach to the synthesis. So we had these very large study by study tables that really went through every single study and outlined the different intervention effects that were estimated in that study. Then we went through and determined for each of these intervention effects, what is the direction? Is this an effect that shows the intervention being favored? Is it a null effect? Is it an effect showing the control being favored? So really one by one going through that. And then in the last step, doing our summary of findings, where we're trying to provide a concise summary of the ranges of the effects that we've seen, as well as a summary of the direction of the effects across the different studies. So yeah, this was a challenging step, but also I think very interesting for us to go through. And that's really it with the concrete conduct of the review. So we've seen the guidance from the Cochrane Rapid Review guidance, as well as how we've kind of operationalized that and addressed challenges for these two different topics. And then there's some other aspects mentioned by the the guidance that I think are interesting, not related to specific stages, but more the overall process. They say, for example, that a rapid review should be preceded by a protocol that's submitted to and approved by Cochrane. The protocol should be registered, one of the online sites like Prospero or the Open Science Framework. And so this also isn't very different from a standard review, right? We always learn for systematic reviews that the protocol is critical, and also making that available is critical. But I think for rapid reviews, where the timelines, again, are quite short, it was really important to get our plan out there so that it was clear to other groups also what was going on, and that hopefully we could deliver some answers within a short timeline. Also, to allow for post hoc changes to the protocol, especially with a very rapidly moving evidence base like this, it's not possible to foresee all of the challenges, all of the issues related to methods or eligibility criteria that might arise. So within a rapid review, it's important to keep some flexibility, but also, of course, to document these changes you might make very, very transparently. So right, the last point, document all post hoc changes, important for transparency, but also incorporating the use of online software. So you might be familiar with pieces of software like Covidence, Distiller SR, and EpiReviewer, and these really help to streamline the process and make sure that these short timelines are doable. There was a study looking specifically at the use, how decision makers use rapid reviews, where they see the value. And I think one thing is important that was established, that it's important for decision makers also. It's important that we communicate that this is an accelerated process. And anytime where there are shortcuts built in, of course, we want to somehow make sure that those shortcuts don't compromise the quality. But there is always a potential trade-off in internal validity linked to such shortcuts and linked to these short timelines. How much of that, how much validity you lose through shortcuts it's very case dependent. It depends on the question, the evidence base, the team, the specific plan. And also it can never be, or it's usually not empirically tested, how much validity one loses in a specific rapid review. And some interesting insight from a large international survey of decision makers basically said that they would expect the same conclusion in a systematic review as in a rapid review. So really what they're expecting is no real difference in the messaging and conclusion that arises. And I think that's important for us as those that are working on rapid reviews to remember that, yes, we're trying to go for an expedited process. We're trying to deliver answers quickly, but actually decision makers want, expect, and maybe even need the level of evidence that we can provide to be fairly similar to that from a standard systematic review. And as a last slide, just a couple of recommendations for the conduct of rapid reviews. And I think some of these are based partly in the literature, and some of them are more from the lessons we've learned over the past almost 2 years now. And I think it's clear that this guidance is a bit more applicable to focused clinical questions than it is to complex public health or health systems questions. That's not to say one shouldn't conduct rapid reviews in these more complex fields, but there will be more challenges, I think, to be expected. It's important to make informed choices about shortcuts. Whenever you build a shortcut into the process, it's really important to think through the implications of that, and also to think about ways to potentially minimize these implications. Where possible, the use of automated tools for screening. So, for example, the Cochrane kind of crowdfunding initiative called Screen for Me is something that could be considered, or at least these integrated software solutions like Covidence or EpiReviewer to use these types of things where possible to streamline the process. It's important to have experienced systematic reviewers on board who have complementary skills. So it's good to have those who are more or less have their expertise in risk of bias, to have others with expertise in risk of bias, others who have expertise in grade assessment. So really having these different individuals is really, really helpful at different stages of the review. A very structured and intensive onboarding and calibration is important to make sure less experienced systematic reviewers can be confident in the work that they're doing throughout the review. And something that's becoming harder and harder with COVID reviews over time is to make sure that team members can block off substantial amounts of time for the duration of the review, because that's the only thing that makes these very short timelines more or less feasible.